seated. We'll go back on the record here in CR 2220-755, State of Idaho versus Chad Daybell. The court took a brief recess. It's now 11:15. The witness, Detective Hermosillo, is still on the witness stand, still under oath. We're still continuing with direct examination. Mr. Wood, you may continue to inquire.
Thank you. Detective Hermosillo, we were discussing your observations of the ERT team in an area that you've identified as a pet cemetery, correct?
That's correct.
For purposes of clarity of the record, I'm going to kind of skip back to a couple things. You've described Mr. Daybell's house as being in Fremont County, correct?
Yes.
And just for purposes of the record, that is Fremont County in the state of Idaho, correct?
Correct.
You described Lori Vallow's apartment complex as being in Madison County.
Correct.
And again, for purposes of clarity of the record, that's Madison County in the state of Idaho.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. All right, let's get back to where we were. You have testified that you observed the ERT team, and I guess that's redundant. I should just say ERT. The T stands for team. You observed ERT uncover the remains of what you believe to be a dog and a cat.
Correct.
What did you further, do you recall approximately what time of day that was? And yeah, what time of day was that?
It was early afternoon. I'd guess 1.
Okay. While you were in that area, did you have a chance to further observe ERT excavate that area you referred to as the pet cemetery?
Yes.
Okay. What did you observe?
I had been away from that area, but when I returned to that area, they had already dug down and located what would appear to be a mass of burnt flesh and charred bone.
Okay. Do you recall approximately how deep down that was?
I don't recall how deep it was.
Okay. Did you observe ERT take that mass out of the ground?
Yes, I did.
Okay. This search that commenced on June 9th, did it finish on June 9th?
No.
Did it continue on to June 10th?
Yes.
Okay. When the search ended on June 9th, was the residence of Chad Daybell secured?
Yes, it was.
And do you recall, did you observe if security guards were placed there?
Yes.
Okay. Let's talk about June 10th. Did you observe that location? Let's go back to that pet cemetery location again. Did you observe any excavation being done on June 10th?
Yes, I did.
What did you observe?
ERT had gone back to the same spot where there was the mass of burnt flesh and bone, and began excavating around that the best they could.
Okay. And what happened?
They were ultimately able to dig completely around the entire mass to reveal what they were digging up.
Okay. And did they remove, again, that mass from that area?
Yes, they did.
Did you see what they did with it?
Yes.
What did they do with it?
They put it in a bag and placed it in the back of the coroner's vehicle.
Okay. Were there any other identifying features of that in that area or as part of that mass that drew your attention?
Yes, there was.
What was it?
There was a melted green bucket that it appeared that the burnt flesh had been placed in. Under the bucket was a partial human skull.
Okay. And was that bucket and what you've just described as a partial human skull, were those also, did you observe what was done with those?
Yes.
What was done with those?
They were also placed into a bag and placed in the coroner's vehicle.
Okay. And do you remember approximately what time those items were placed in the coroner's vehicle, approximately?
Afternoon, maybe 3 or 4-ish.
Okay. For the purposes of your investigation, what else did you do on June 10th?
I followed the Fremont County coroner, Fremont County Detective Vince Kaikamanu and Ron Ball. We went to Boise to the Ada County Coroner's Office with the remains that were recovered that day.
Okay. Did you, before you left to go to Boise, did you have an opportunity to go to the Madison Memorial Hospital in Rexford?
Yes.
And what did you do there?
Recovered the remains found from the first day as well.
Okay. And you observed what you recognize as those same remains?
That's correct.
Okay. Detective, I'm going to call your attention to June 11th. What did you do in furtherance of your investigation that day?
We were at the Ada County Coroner's Office.
Okay, and let me stop you real quick. About what time did you get there?
We arrived there on June 10th.
Okay.
That day on June 11th, we got there in the morning.
And let's go back to June 10th really quick. When you arrived in Boise, what was the first thing you did there?
We went to the Ada County Coroner's Office.
Okay. Do you remember approximately what time you got there?
Evening.
Okay. All right. And now back to June 11th. Approximately what time did you return to the coroner's office?
Early morning.
Okay. Detective, once you arrived on June 11th, what did you do in furtherance of your investigation?
Observed the autopsies of those remains that were recovered.
Okay. Now you've discussed two separate, I'll at this point call them items of interest. Did you recognize those items of interest again in the coroner's office?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And do you know if those items had been secured there the night before?
They had been.
Okay. Once you arrived in the autopsy room, what was the first thing you observed?
The first thing I observed was the black bag that was covered in duct tape that had been removed from the area underneath the tree by the pond, was placed on the table.
Okay, and you recognize that as the same black bag?
Yes.
How did you recognize that?
The duct tape and the black plastic that had still had dirt all over it.
What did you observe? Who was with you?
The medical examiner was in the room, Lieutenant Ron Ball, Detective Vince Kaikamanu, and the Fremont County Coroner, Brenda Dye.
Okay. Was there a medical examiner there?
Yes.
Do you know who he was?
Garth Warren.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Judge.
Garth Warren.
And you've testified you observed those proceedings,
Yes.
correct? Once that bag was, as you testified, moved to the table, what did you observe was done with it?
The ME grabbed a small sharp instrument and cut down the middle of the black plastic.
Okay. And what did you observe?
I observed a small child in red pajamas, red pajama shirt, red pajama pants, black socks that had the word Skechers in orange across the toes. I also observed a light and blue blanket that had been placed on top of him.
Okay. Detective, were there, when you observed what you perceived to be a child, was there anything that drew your attention?
Yes.
Can you describe for the court what drew your attention?
The amount of duct tape that was covering the body.
Okay. Where was that duct tape located?
On the head, arms, and feet.
Okay. Let's talk about the head area. When you looked at the head, what did you observe there?
The head had a white plastic bag over the top of it. It appeared to be a normal trash bag, had a red drawstring. It appeared to be the expandable type of trash bag with the waffle style pattern on top of the head.
Okay. And you had mentioned duct tape there. Where did you observe the duct tape?
There was duct tape that was tightly wrapped around this way, tightly from his chin to his forehead area. Several layers of duct tape tightly wrapped.
Okay. What did you observe the medical examiner and his team do with that material?
They ended up using a small sharp instrument and cut down the middle of it to expose what was underneath.
Okay, and when they exposed underneath, what did you observe?
An additional piece of duct tape that was stretched from jawline to jawline across the mouth.
Okay, and when you say across the mouth, at this point, were you looking at this child's face?
I was.
Okay. As you looked at this child's face, did you recognize this child?
Yes, I did.
How did you recognize this child?
From the hundreds of photographs and video I've seen over the last 8 months, I recognize that to be the same little boy that was laying on the table.
Okay, and can you, who was that little boy?
Joshua Vallow.
Okay. Were there any features that helped you recognize him?
Yes.
What were they?
He had the same style haircut that he had in the videos that I had seen and the photographs I had seen just prior to my welfare check with him in September, the last photograph I had seen on September 22nd. And that was shaved on the sides and longer on top.
Okay. Thank you. Were there any other items of, were there any other items of interest to you on that body?
Yes.
Can you just, what were they?
His hands were folded about chest high.
Detective, can you lift that a little bit higher so that we can see?
Folded like this, chest high. He had duct tape continuously wrapped from elbow all the way around his arms, over his hands, all the way to his right elbow. Several layers of duct tape that were tightly wrapped. And the best way I can describe it is he had a ball of duct tape over where his hands would be.
Okay. Was that duct tape removed?
Yes, it was.
And what did you observe after that?
His wrists were also bound with another layer of duct tape.
Okay. After that, was there anything else that caught your attention about the way this child was found?
Yes, I noticed that his ankles were also bound with duct tape as well.
Okay. After you observed that, did you observe the autopsy of that child?
I did.
Okay. Detective, upon the conclusion of that autopsy, did you witness another examination that day?
Yes, I did.
Do you remember approximately when that examination started?
In the afternoon.
Okay. What did you observe in that second examination?
I observed the same melted green bucket with the charred flesh and charred bone that was located on Mr. Daybell's property that was now sitting on the table in the medical examiner's office.
Okay, thank you. Your Honor, the state has no further questions at this time.
Thank you. Cross-examination, Mr. Pryor.
Thank you, Your Honor. Officer, I'd like to go back to the initial contact with Mr. Daybell.
Mr. Pryor, will you pull that microphone closer to your mouth?
I apologize, Judge.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay, Officer?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to the initial contact with Mr. Daybell. And again, in November, when was that date, sir?
The initial contact with Mr. Daybell was on the 26th of November, 2019.
At approximately what time, Officer?
Early morning hours, around 9, I would say.
Okay. Was that contact recorded?
It was not.
Is there a reason why you didn't record that contact?
It's not common practice for detectives to carry body cams.
Is it common practice for detectives to record conversations with witnesses when you interview them?
It is.
Can you understand why it's important that an interview with a witness is recorded?
Yes.
And it's important to record a witness or an interview with a witness so that we get the factual statements made by people recorded accurately. Would you agree with that?
I would.
And it's important that when we make statements and we make representations regarding statements that people make and observations, that they're accurate observations, right?
That's correct.
And one of the best ways to do that is to record those observations. Would you agree with me?
I would.
Okay. This was somewhat of an important case, was it not?
Not at that time. It was just a welfare check.
Okay. And then this welfare check turned into an interview with Mr. Cox and Mr. Daybell, however, correct?
Correct.
At any time, did you think that maybe you should have recorded this?
No, sir.
Okay. Did you record any of the other interviews with any of the other witnesses throughout your investigation?
I did.
And whose interviews have you recorded?
Melanie Boudreau's interview.
Then let's stop there. How many times did you talk with Melanie Boudreau?
Objection. This exceeds the scope of the direct.
Mr. Pryor, before we go any further, I'm hearing a shutter. Can the media please turn off the shutter sound? It's impeding my ability to hear the attorneys from both the state and the defense. Mr. Pryor, let me go back there. Mr. Wood, the objection is based upon exceeding the scope of the direct. Mr. Pryor, I'll let you respond to that objection.
Well, Judge, throughout his testimony, he made at least a couple of references to interviewing other members of the family and having conversations with them about various facts in this as part of his testimony with Mr. Wood. Quite honestly, if he's talking as Mr. Boudreau is one of those folks that he gained information from, one, I'm going to get into what information did he gather from them, and two, whether or not that's been memorialized in the form of a recording. So I think it is relevant, and I think, quite honestly, it's permissible inquiry in this particular case.
At this point, Your Honor, he's asking for hearsay information, and again, he's way outside the scope of what Detective Hermosillo testified to.
Mr. Pryor, as it pertains, I think there were a couple questions as to a search of an apartment that belonged to Miss Bedreau. I think that there was some brief questioning about questions of family members, but as far as the depth of those conversations, your objection was that they were hearsay. I agree with Mr. Wood, they are hearsay. Tell me where you're desiring to go. If you're just laying some foundation or getting some information about the communication, when it happened, etc., I think that that's completely relevant and it's completely within the scope. If it's beyond that, tell me what your argument is.
Well, Judge, quite honestly, I'm not necessarily seeking the exact information that those particular witnesses provided to this officer. What I'm trying to seek is a timeline as to exactly who he spoke to and when, and where he gathered this information. And as part of seeking that information as to who he spoke to, when he spoke to as part of this case, I would like to know whether or not that's a recorded conversation. So I am afforded the opportunity to look at what this officer testifies to today and compare it to what those recordings are. And I think it's important that I be afforded that opportunity. And as part of this, it's a preliminary hearing. Preliminarily, I would like to know whether or not this officer recorded the conversations.
With that, I will allow the questions pertaining to who he spoke to and when he spoke to them, whether or not they were recorded. But as far as the substance of those conversations, I will sustain the objection that Mr. Wood has raised as far as hearsay.
All right. You spoke with Melanie Boudreau, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And how many times did you speak with her?
One time.
And when was that, sir?
December 3rd, 2019.
Was that as part of the investigation of the welfare check?
Yes, it was.
Okay, was there any other inquiry in there as to, were you at that point, had this moved into an area of trying to decide whether there had been any foul play with JJ or Tylee?
I was asking Miss Boudreau how we could get a hold of Mr. Daybell or Lori Vallow.
Okay, and that's to inquire as to the whereabouts of JJ at that time?
That is correct.
What about Tylee? Had it moved into that as well?
I did ask about Tylee.
Okay, at this...
Your Honor, I'm going to object again. He's now asking for information from those interviews. It has nothing to do with the scope of the direct examination.
I'm not asking for information from Ms. Boudreau. I'm asking what this officer did as part of his investigation. Judge, we've just spent 2 hours listening to this officer talk about all of the steps in detail that he's done as part of his investigation. I think, quite honestly, I ought to be able to ask some very basic questions about what witnesses he interviewed as part of that investigation. I can't even fathom how that's not allowable inquiry. And I think, quite honestly, I don't know if Mr. Wood doesn't want to give me the information, or if this officer doesn't want to give me the information, but clearly I ought to be allowed to inquire as to what this officer did as part of his investigation.
As it pertains to the inquiry of whether or not Tylee Ryan was discussed, I'll allow that question. I'll have the officer answer that question. The deeper substance of that conversation, I agree, is beyond the scope.
Okay. Was part of your inquiry to discuss Tylee as well?
Yes, it was.
So this had gone beyond the welfare check of JJ. It had gone to, we're trying to find out if there's any sort of issues regarding JJ and Tylee at this point. Is that correct?
We're trying to find their whereabouts.
Okay. And at that point, were you concerned about their whereabouts in
Yes,
December?
we were. Yes, we were.
Were you significantly concerned about their whereabouts in December?
Yes, we were.
Okay. Was that conversation with Melanie Boudreau, was that a recorded conversation?
It was.
Okay. And you provided that to the prosecuting attorney?
Yes.
As well as a statement of your complete interview with... Judge, I heard a noise. I'm sorry.
I think it was someone's chair.
Okay. As well as a complete dissertation of what that interview involved. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So in December, it was important that you record that conversation. What other family members did you discuss the case with? Let's try Garth. Did you talk to Garth?
I didn't personally talk to Garth.
You did not?
No, I did not.
Okay. Did you talk to Emma?
I did not personally talk to Emma.
Did you talk to Melanie Gibbs?
I did talk to Melanie Gibb.
You did?
Yes.
How many times?
By what date, sir?
How about from the time you started investigating this in November until yesterday?
Your Honor, this is far beyond the scope of the direct. A preliminary hearing, as the case law states, it's in no sense a trial. Not a trial. It does not require the same formality and precision observed at a trial. The state is not required to put on every bit of evidence it has. And the scope of the cross-examination should be limited to the direct. At this point, the defense is using this as a fishing expedition to try and find out everything that they may want to know, but that is not the subject of this preliminary hearing. This is a probable cause hearing. That's why we're here. It's not a hearing for the defense to ask every question they may want to ask.
And Judge, when the prosecuting attorney elects to spend 2 hours with a witness going into what I call significant detail about every aspect of this case, at that point, this prosecuting attorney opened the door to allowing me to inquire about all of this stuff. Quite honestly, he doesn't get it both ways. He doesn't get to say, I'm going to have this officer talk in great detail about every facet of this case from the beginning of his investigation through the end, all the way to the autopsy, and say, oh, Mr. Pryor, I'm now going to object to you inquiring and seeking information about the steps that were taken as part of this investigation from beginning to end. He doesn't get it both ways. It works so that I get a fair opportunity to inquire of this officer. I'm not asking of substance of those witnesses. I understand, and I understand completely the hearsay rules. But quite honestly, Judge, I'm dumbfounded by the fact that he's objecting, because I'm trying to find out who this officer spoke to and whether or not those questions and those conversations were recorded. This is not delving into specifics about each of the individual witnesses. I clearly should be permitted to go down this road.
All right, the court's going to take a brief recess here. I'm going to look at one thing that I have a question about. We're going to take 5 minutes, and then we'll go back on the record and proceed with the cross.
All right.
Thank you. Please be seated. We'll go back on the record. CR 2220-755, State versus Daybell. Court took a brief recess. For the recess, there was an objection made by the state. That objection was based upon going beyond the scope of direct examination of Detective Hermosillo. Mr. Pryor responded with the argument that he was inquiring into facts of the investigation. The court initially overruled the objection and stated that I would allow the questions pertaining to who was spoken to, whether that conversation was recorded, when the conversation took place in the course of the investigation. I will stand by my ruling that I will allow Mr. Pryor to continue to inquire of the witness as to that state of the investigation. When it comes to the substance of those interviews or inquiries of the witnesses and or family, I'm going to sustain Mr. Robb's objection going forward that those will be unallowed or disallowed based upon hearsay. I think there's also a scope of the direct that would also come into play at that point. So Mr. Pryor, if you'd like to proceed with the questioning of Mr. or Detective Hermosillo on cross, you may do so.
Thank you, Your Honor. Detective, when we were on the subject of Melanie Gibb, you spoke with her as well, is that correct?
That's correct.
Was that a recorded conversation?
I think one of them, the last one was.
Well,
when I spoke with her, we were on the phone. She was in Arizona, and I was on a cell phone.
Did you ever have the occasion? Now, my recollection, and correct me if I'm wrong, officer, my notes seem to reflect that you said you spoke with Melanie Gibb once. Was I incorrect in my notes?
No, I had spoken with her once in person.
Oh, once in person, okay.
And then on the phone the rest of the time.
Okay, and the date that you spoke to her in person, where was that location?
That was in Salt Lake City.
And the date of
or
that?
Provo, I believe. Provo.
And that discussion in Salt Lake City was on what date, sir?
I don't recall the date.
Okay, all right. Now, you said it was Salt Lake City. It was Provo, was it not?
It was Provo area, yeah.
Provo area, not Salt Lake City, correct. And as part of that discussion, you drove down to Salt Lake City to interview her, is that correct?
That's correct.
And accompanying you on that trip was Lieutenant Ball, is that correct?
That's correct.
And also accompanying you on that trip was Mr. Wood, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And do you have any recollection of during that one-to-one face-to-face interview between you, Mr. Wood, Lieutenant Ball, and yourself and Melanie Gibb, was that recorded at any time?
I believe Lieutenant Ball had recorded that conversation.
You believe or you know?
I believe he recorded the conversation.
You did not record it?
No, sir.
Who was the head investigator of this investigation at this point?
I was the lead investigator,
okay.
But he was the supervisor on scene.
Okay, and as the lead investigator, you chose not to record that conversation, is that correct?
I did not record that conversation.
And as the lead investigator, you chose not to record that conversation. That was an affirmative decision not to record the conversation.
Objection asked and answered.
I didn't
Sustained. You can move on, Mr. Pryor.
And then there was a phone conversation with Ms. Gibb, is that correct?
That is correct.
When was that?
That was in December sometime.
Is there a reason you don't know the specific dates? In a number of instances here, we've had occasions where you seem to suggest the month, but you don't know the specific date. Is there a reason behind that?
Those weren't super important dates to me. I interviewed a lot of people throughout the last 8 months.
Okay, and as a preparation for this hearing, did you review your reports and your supplements as part of your preparation to testify today?
I did.
Okay. And in spite of reading that supplement and refreshing your recollection, you still don't remember the specific dates and times?
Sir, forgive me. I can't remember every single word for an 8-month investigation on dates and times.
And with all due respect to you, sir, I'm not questioning your integrity and I'm not questioning your honesty. But quite honestly, there's a lot of information here, is there not?
There is.
And there's a lot of things that are said as part of this investigation, is there not?
There is.
Okay. And I'd like to go back to the time on November 27th, I believe, or maybe was it 26th? I'm sorry, it's November 26th. And even myself, I get dates wrong. But on November 26th, when you interviewed Mr. Daybell, you said that Mr. Daybell said he didn't know Lori Vallow very well. Is that correct?
That is correct.
It's not recorded. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Is it possible that he said, I know her? And you said, how well do you know her? And he responded, well, I don't know her.
Objection, hearsay.
I'm asking a question as to whether this is possible he said this. And if he's going down the road of hearsay, Judge, this has already been ruled on.
Your Honor, it calls for hearsay.
I'm going to overrule the objection. Mr. Pryor, you may continue with the question. I believe the question was, is it possible?
Right. Is it possible that Mr. Daybell said, I don't know her as well as Alex?
No, that's not what I remember.
Okay. But you've already acknowledged that your recollection and the number of facts may not be completely accurate. Is that correct?
Objection, argumentative.
Sustained.
Do you have a clear recollection of every statement made by every single witness in this case, sir?
Objection, argumentative.
I'll allow the question.
Do you have a clear recollection of every statement of every witness made in this case, sir?
No.
Do you have a clear recollection of every date and the substance and time of every date as part of your investigation in this case?
Objection, relevance.
Mr. Pryor?
It goes to his recollection. It goes to bias, Judge.
I'm going to overrule the objection. You may answer the question, Detective Hermosillo.
Would you ask it again, please?
Just the recollection of every date and time in this case as part of your investigation.
No, I don't.
And you would agree with me that it's possible that Mr. Daybell said that I don't know her as well.
Objection, asked and answered.
Mr. Pryor, there's an objection as to asked and answered.
Judge, I laid the foundation and went down the same road, but the question is slightly different. Is it possible that you made a mistake about whether or not Mr. Daybell stated what you claimed he stated?
Mr. Wood?
Your Honor, at this point, defense is clearly trying to get in a statement of his own client. That's hearsay. There's no exception for it. If he wants to get in Mr. Daybell's testimony, he can put Mr. Daybell on the stand.
I'm going to sustain the objection on the ground that it's been asked and answered. I think it was asked the exact same way. I don't think he answered it in the way that you wanted him to answer it, but it has been asked and answered. Let's move on.
Okay. Now, officer, your testimony originally was that the last time that they saw JJ was the 22nd of September.
Objection, that's vague reference to they. Doesn't state who that is.
So the objection is to foundation?
Yes.
All right. Mr. Pryor, do you want to lay a little bit more foundation before engaging in a conversation on that date?
As part of your investigation, you were able to ascertain a date based on reviewing pictures and evidence of when you believe the last time JJ Vallow was seen. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And as part of your testimony to today, you said you believe that the last day was the 22nd of September. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, as part of your investigation, did you contact JJ's school?
Yes, we did.
And as part of your investigation, were you able to ascertain the last day that the school had him registered and attending school?
Yes.
And that was the September 23rd, was it not?
That is not correct.
Would it surprise you to learn that there are statements about JJ Vallow attending school on the 23rd?
Initially, we talked to the school and we had an unexcused absence on the 23rd, but an excused absence on the 24th. So in the initial part of the investigation, we believe that JJ may have gone to school on the 23rd, but later learned that was not the case.
And as part of your investigation into that issue, did you record that conversation with any of the officials?
I did not personally speak to the school.
Do you know who spoke to the school?
Detective Dave Hope.
you talked and made reference to hundreds of pictures and videos. Do you remember saying that?
That is correct.
Did you provide those hundreds of pictures and videos to the prosecuting attorney?
I assumed that he had gotten the photographs that we have gotten.
Okay, but that wasn't the question. The question is you made mention of reviewing hundreds of photos and hundreds of videos. Okay.
Objection. I think he's misstating the witness's earlier testimony.
Mr. Pryor, will you repeat the question? And Mr. Wood, if you believe he is misstating the witness's testimony, I'll allow you to make the objection again.
Judge, the witness had previously said that as part of his investigation, he looked at hundreds of videos and pictures. I'm inquiring as to whether or not all of those videos, those hundreds of videos and hundreds of pictures have been provided to Mr. Wood as part of this case.
I'll allow the question. I'll direct the witness to answer.
During the course of the investigation, there have been numerous people that had played YouTube videos, friends that had uploaded things to the internet, things of that nature, which we saw Tylee or JJ on. The videos and photographs that we had obtained, the prosecutor has copies of.
Okay. But then other videos that you've used as part of your investigation that were on YouTube. And when you're talking about these videos, you're talking about people in the community who have posted videos and audio, who have, this has drawn a significant amount of local attention. Would you agree with me?
I would agree.
And there's been a significant amount of people posting videos, posting pictures, posting audio in Fremont and Madison County. Would you agree with that, sir?
Yes.
Now, as part of your search warrant, initially to go into the, and there were 3 apartments, if my recollection is correct, and please correct me if I make a mistake. There were 3 apartments that you sought and obtained a search warrant for, is that correct?
That's correct.
And the date that you sought that search warrant was when, sir?
November 27th, 2019.
And the purpose of that search warrant was to search to determine whether or not Joshua J. Vallow was present in any of those apartments. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Was the purpose of that search warrant to obtain information and gather evidence in other regards?
No.
The sole purpose was to go in there to look and see if there was a human person in any of those units. Is that correct?
We were looking for any person in those units and to see if we can find out the whereabouts of JJ.
Okay. Was it part of that? Did that search warrant scope include the ability to obtain and take evidence and information to help support you in a later time?
Yes, it did.
Okay. Now, when you searched Alex's apartment, and that was 107, is that right?
Alex was staying in 175. That's where his belongings were.
In 175?
Yes.
And who was the person who owned 175 or rented 175, excuse me?
On the rental agreement, I believe it was Alex Cox that was on 175.
Okay, and what number was Lori Vallow's?
107.
And you also went into 174, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and Melanie Boudreaux's was what?
174.
If I could have just a moment, Judge.
You may. Mr. Pryor, Mr. Pryor, if you do not want that to be on the record, you need to push that button right in front of the microphone there so that green light is not on while you're talking. If you hold it, you need to hold it down. Thank you.
So in 175, was there any indication that Alex Cox had any belongings in there whatsoever of any kind?
In 175?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Were there any indications that Alex Cox had belongings in 107?
107 was vacant.
Okay. Was there any indication that Lori Vallow had ever resided in 175?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have a length of time as to how long she was in 175?
No.
Okay. Are you of the opinion that Lori Vallow and Alex Cox were living together in Unit 175 at some time?
Objection calls for speculation.
Do you have any personal information as part of your investigation that Lori Vallow and Alex Cox were residing together in Unit 175?
I have no information that they lived there at the same time.
Okay. They may have lived there at different times in that unit. Is that what you're suggesting?
I'm suggesting when we did the surveillance, that's where Lori Vallow was residing, and we had
She was
located
residing where?
in 175.
Okay. All right. And we're going to get to the surveillance. So you talked about that in a minute, if you may. So at any point, as part of your surveillance, did you see her residing in 107?
No.
As part of your surveillance, was there a recording of any of the surveillance tapes?
No.
Did you record anything?
No.
How many hours would you suggest you did in surveillance of the Vallow apartment 175?
Oh, 15, 20 hours worth, maybe.
Okay. You talked about phone records initially in regards to the November 27th inquiry. Whose phone records specifically were you looking at as part of your initial investigation?
Lori Vallow's and Chad Daybell's.
Did you inquire as to Alex Cox's phone records?
I believe we did. I'm not sure if it was on the 27th or not.
Okay. All right. Did you inquire as to when Lori Vallow and Alex Cox both moved here together? Approximately what date?
Yes.
When was that?
1st of September.
And you made some reference to the relationship between Lori and Alex. Do you have specific information that would suggest they had a very close relationship?
Yes.
And what information is that, officer?
Information we had obtained through Gilbert, Arizona, through their investigation.
Okay. And when Lori Vallow chose to move here on the 1st of September, Alex Cox at the same time moved here as well, did he not?
He did.
Okay. And in fact, they lived together for a portion of the time, did they not?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay. Is it possible that they did live together?
Objection, Your Honor. I fail to see how this is relevant.
There's
I'll
been an
move on.
objection as to relevance.
Judge, I think I'm just going to move on. I think
Okay.
I can inquire in another manner about this evidence through another witness. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to turn our attention now to the picture or the demonstrative evidence, and I believe it's exhibit number 10. And if you would be so kind again to get the pointer out and point where Mr. Daybell's vehicle was parked.
So the court record is clear. Exhibit number 10 has remained up on an easel for the entire time on cross-examination.
Okay.
And the inquiry is about exhibit 10 that still exists on the easel. Go
Now,
ahead.
how was the car parked in the driveway, officer?
It was backed into the driveway facing west.
Okay. So the car was backed in. Was it all the way to the garage or was it partially in the driveway?
Sir, if you look at this, was taken that morning.
Okay.
So that's exactly where he was parked that morning when he was sitting in the vehicle.
Well, I appreciate you pointing that out to me. What I would like you to do is verbalize how far close to the garage was the car in relation to the garage.
10 feet.
So 10 feet from the door of the garage towards the street, is that correct?
Rough guess, yes.
And Judge, may I have permission to move freely towards that exhibit?
There's another pointer, I think, that's over there. Is there not, bailiff? Is there just a... All right. If you're going to move over there, Mr. Pryor, number one, I'm going to require you to wear a mask. And then number two, do you plan on touching the exhibit?
No, Judge, in light of the court's concerns, I think what I'll do is I'll try to talk this witness through this as well, rather than, and I see where the court is going, and I agree. If I'm unable to do that, then I may request that the bailiff give me another pointer and we do it that way. I agree with the court.
Okay.
So in regards to the car being parked, and I will represent to you, officer, that I've been out to that house probably 6 or 7 times. How many times have you been out to the house?
15 or 20.
Okay, when is the last time you were out there?
The last search warrant I served on the residence.
Okay. Now, on that day, can you give me the date and the time, the month and the date of when you were doing the search again? It was in June, correct?
Which search are you referring to?
The search that excavated and removed the evidence from behind the tree and the pet cemetery.
That's correct, June 9th.
Okay. And on June 9th, I'm looking at that picture and you say that's a picture taken of that situation. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I'm looking at the tree and the tree looks like it has foliage on it, correct?
Correct.
Now, when I'm in the driveway and I'm standing, and quite honestly, I'll represent to you that I did the same thing you did. And the view to the tree back there where they found one of the remains is not particularly visible. So your testimony is that it
Objection that he's just testifying now.
The court is going to completely disregard any testimony or any information that's being provided by the attorney, Mr. Wood. If you're laying a little bit of foundation here for a question, Mr. Pryor, you may do so, but,
okay.
But let the record reflect your testimony is obviously not evidence.
So is it still your testimony that there's a visible line of sight between where the automobile was parked and that tree back in the corner where there were remains excavated?
I never gave the testimony there was a clear line of sight. I simply said that he was looking towards the pond area.
Oh, okay. So he wasn't necessarily, he looked over there. Did he look anywhere else at that point?
I saw him looking towards the pond area.
Okay. But the question was, did he look anywhere else?
I'm sure he did look other places.
So he was looking around. Is that correct?
No, sir. That's not correct.
He made motions to look in different directions. Is that correct?
He wasn't looking as intently anywhere else as he was towards the pond area.
And you can agree with me that it's somewhat alarming if someone shows up at your property and decides to bring a number of people to start digging up your property. Would that cause anyone concern?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I'd like to go to the, back to the tree behind what's called the pond area. When we're talking about the excavation of the pond area, how deep down was it that the remains were found in the pond area back there?
I'd guess 6-8 inches.
Shallow.
Shallow.
And then in regards to the pet cemetery, how far down into the ground in the pet cemetery?
I couldn't testify to that. I wasn't there when they began the initial digging.
Fair enough. And based on the 25, I'm sorry, I misstated that, didn't I? 15 trips that you took out there? Is that what you said?
Yes, sir.
15 to 20? On the
Yes.
15 to 20 trips out there, do you have a recollection of how big that pet cemetery is?
Not every trip that I made out there was to the backyard.
Okay. Do you have a recollection or an estimate, having been out, you've been next to the pet cemetery, correct?
That's correct.
And you viewed it, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you're trained as a police officer to recall facts and obtain evidence. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So when you're looking at a site where they're exhuming evidence, it would seem fair to assume that you would have an idea about how large of an area this pet cemetery was. So can you tell me how large the pet cemetery is?
I didn't worry about measuring that. That's what the FBI recovery team was for.
Now, you saw a marker on the pet cemetery that marked the pet cemetery of a dog. Is that correct?
A dog was dug up there, yes.
But you saw a post and like a monument or a picture of a dog.
That's correct.
Right? And that was basically almost like a headstone. Is that correct?
I couldn't tell you what the statue was for.
But still, you don't know what the statue was?
No, what it was for.
Oh, what it was for. What was it a statue of?
I believe it was a dog.
Okay. So there's no doubt that this was a pet cemetery. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And there's no doubt that this was a well-defined fire pit that was back there, correct?
Correct.
This wasn't a fire pit that was created out of the blue. It was a fire pit that was well established for a significant amount of time. Would you agree with that?
Objection calls for speculation.
There's a question. If there's speculation in the answer, I'll direct the witness to not answer. But if the witness knows the answer to that question.
Judge, may I redefine my inquiry a little bit to help in that regard?
You may.
Thank you, Your Honor. When you're referring to a fire pit back there, was there an actual circular area where there was a fire pit?
That's correct.
Was there also an area where there was numerous places where they were burning various items? Is that correct?
I did not see that.
Okay. Now, you talked a little bit about your experience in identifying human remains, and that it offers a unique smell when you see human remains. Do you recall testifying about that?
I didn't testify to my experience on identifying human remains. I testified to the smell of a decomposing body.
Okay. And that is a very unique smell, is it not?
It is.
Have you ever had an occasion to smell what the smell of burning flesh smells like?
No.
Objection relevance. The witness never testified to that.
Well, he talked about the fact that when he observed the area of the pet cemetery, that he observed burned flesh and burned bones. And I think I ought to be able to inquire as to where his knowledge of making that representation comes from.
Just so I'm clear, I believe that the testimony pertaining to a smell came from the first uncovering of a body, and that's not the same place as the pet cemetery. So, Mr. Pryor, with that information, tell me where you're going.
Judge, I just want to inquire, Judge, as to where he gains his knowledge of being able to identify that remains were actually burned, and that bones were burned. And I'd like to know where the source of that knowledge is.
So if you want to ask questions about his background on burned flesh or whatever else, you can do so. I'll let you do that. Mr. Wood, any other comments?
No.
Do you have any experience in identifying burned flesh and burned bones?
Do you find experience? You mean?
Have you been part of investigations that have involved other burned bones or other burned flesh?
No.
Have you ever had an occasion to smell what it's like when human remains are burned or scorched?
Yes.
Okay. And that lays off a very distinct smell, does it not?
It does.
And it's beyond pungent. It's a very, very easily identifiable smell when human remains are burned, is it not?
It is.
And that's something that would be very noticeable if, in fact, human remains were burned. It's very identifiable. And you would agree with that, would you not?
Objection calls for speculation.
Judge, he testified about his experience. I think I ought to be able to inquire as to whether it's easily identifiable.
I'll allow the question. If the witness knows the answer to the question, he can answer. If he does not, he can say he doesn't know.
All right. Do you know whether it's easily identifiable in your experience?
Freshly burned flesh?
Burned flesh.
This had been sitting out there for quite a while, so the overwhelming smell of the decomposition is what I smelled.
And I appreciate that, but what I'm asking you about is whether or not the smell of burning flesh is a very identifiable smell.
That's right.
And it's very, and it's not something that's easily disguised. You would agree with that, correct?
I would agree.
Okay, now let's go back to the chart. And let's go back to, excuse me, I said chart, Judge. I want to say exhibit number 10, the demonstrative evidence.
Noted.
Thank you, Your Honor. And I'll slow down, Judge. I think I'm getting a nod from our friend at the clerk saying for me to slow down. So, Madam Clerk, I will pace a little better. Thank you for your patience. When I'm looking at that aerial view, and I'd like you to take the pointer and put it at the front where Mr. Daybell's car is parked. Okay. Directly across the street, are there any residences?
There is a residence.
Do you know the owners of those residences?
No, I do not.
Okay, did you interview them?
I did not personally.
Did anybody interview them?
I can't answer to that.
Okay. Now, directly across where the pond is, we'll go to the pond and then we'll head towards the road. Is there a residence there?
There is.
And there's no obstruction of the view of that residence to the pond. Would you agree with that?
I can't testify to that, sir.
Do you see any trees that are blocking the view from that house across the street to the pond?
I can't see what's on the other side of the road
Okay,
based on
fair
this.
enough, fair enough. And now I'd like you to put the pointer on the pet cemetery. And from the pet cemetery, go to 1900. No, I'm sorry, go to the other street, not 1900, that street. And I'm trying to recall, and I'm sorry, my memory is the same thing. I'm trying to remember the name of the street. The name of the street is what?
200 North.
200 North, that's right. And across from the pet cemetery, directly across from the pet cemetery on the other side of the street is another residence, is there not?
There is.
And then if you take the house and you go on the corner of the house that's sticking out, and almost kitty corner 200 and 1900. Could you put the marker on that as well?
200 and 1900?
Yeah, just in the right there. Now, if you go on the opposite side of the street, there's a residence there as well, is there not?
Over here?
Yes.
Yes.
And then a kitty corner from the Daybell house, there's a white residence across the street as well, is there not?
Your Honor, I'm going to object. This exceeds the scope of the direct examination. We never spoke about neighbors or houses outside of the Daybell property.
This is the last question I'll allow, Mr. Pryor.
All right. Is there a residence kitty corner from the Daybell residence?
Where Chad's daughter lives? Is that where you're talking?
Well, thank you for that. But yes, where Emma lived at one point?
Yes, right down here there is.
So if I count correctly, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 residences surrounding the Daybell residence. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Specifically, who was present at the excavation at the pond? Do you have a recollection of who exactly was there?
No, I do not.
Okay. Do you have a recollection of who exactly was at the pet cemetery?
Not everybody. No, I do not.
Do you have a broad estimate of how many people were there?
50, 30, 50, somewhere in there.
35 to 50 people?
That's
And
accurate.
those were a combination of the Rexburg Police Department?
Rexburg Police, FBI, and Fremont County.
How many FBI agents do you recollect being there?
I can't recall. I can't answer that.
Okay. Did you have an occasion to interview David Warwick?
We did.
Was that a recorded conversation?
That was the same time Melanie Gibb was interviewed.
So the question was, again, was that a recorded
I
conversation?
believe it was by Lieutenant Ball.
And you interviewed Ian Pawlowski,
Yes,
and you interviewed Melanie Bordeaux, is that right?
that's correct.
And now she's going by Pawlowski, is that correct? They're married, I guess, right?
Yes,
Okay. And again, were those interviews recorded?
they were.
And Judge, if I could have just a moment to review my notes, may I?
You may.
Thank you, Your Honor.
If you're going to speak to your client, please push that button.
Judge, I think that's all I have at this point. Thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. Wood, it is approximately 5 minutes to noon. Would you like to do redirect right now, or do you want to take a break right now and do redirect after lunch?
Your Honor, if we do any redirect, we'll wait till after lunch.
We're going to take a recess right now, then we'll reconvene at 1 p.m. And at that point, we will start redirect with Mr. Wood and the witness, Detective Hermosillo. We'll be back here in an hour.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right.